Hey guys, welcome to today's video. I would like to extend my Django playlist. I recently discovered a thing called middleware. If you don't know what middleware is, I'll teach it to you now. So for example, let's say Mr. Jim or Little Jim here is a kid who wants to buy games from Steam. In our example, Steam is the server. But not everything is perfect in this scenario. Let's say we have Jim's dad that overlooks everything about his son. He wants him to study and work hard. So in this case, since Jim's dad is middleware, what he will do is he will look at Jim, he will look at his situation, he will look at his circumstances, and then decide if Jim is allowed to buy games from Steam. However, the problem is, let's say Jim's dad is not really happy with Jim, or if he's not studying, then he can simply refuse Jim and not let him buy games from Steam. Otherwise, if he's happy, he can let Jim buy games and enjoy them. Furthermore, since Jim's dad is middleware, he can even call the credit card company and ask the company to cancel all transactions that involve Steam. So now that we know what middleware is, let's now write some code. So here's the code that we left off in our previous video for Django. To recap, we learned about view sets and routers. I'll link the video in the description below. Anyways, we'll be using this code and then we'll integrate middleware into our code base. Let's first start by creating an example middleware. So within my API folder, I'll create a new file and I'll call it middleware.py. So let's now write a simple middleware function. So I'll call it def simple middleware. It will accept a callback function called getResponse, which as the name suggests, it will give you the response of every request. In the next line, I'll create my actual middleware function. It will have a request parameter. So as an example, for example, before a request, I can simply write before the request process. And then after we get a response, so to check if we got a response, I can simply go get response. Sorry, it's request. And then in the next line, when you've got a response, I can write print after response. So my next step is to register this middleware function into my project. So I collapse this folder, I go to Django tutorial within settings.py. I find my middleware array, which is around here, and then let's link it. So in my case, it's api.middleware. And then the name of my middleware function. So in this case, it's simple middleware. That's it. I'll now run this project and see if everything works. So cd Django tutorial and then python manage.py run server. I have an error here. So as it suggests, I haven't configured it properly. So of course, when you get a response, what you have to do is return this response. And then here, I'll also return the getResponse function. And if everything's fine, it will now work. So for example, in my API client, if I click on send, I get my response, and going back to my console, I don't see my print statements. Again, I've made another error. So middleware was not accessed. I just have to return it like so. Going back to my API client, now if I click on send a couple of times, I go back to my API client before the request process and after response. So now it works. So now we've written our first middleware function. What's next? There's another way to rewrite our middleware. According to our documentation, we can even use classes to write our middleware. One advantage of class-based middleware, according to the documentation, is that you can use hooks. Another advantage I can think of is that your whole code base might be using classes, in this case, which it is. Then rewriting your middleware as a class allows for more consistency. So let's now refactor this function. I'll delete this function, and then let's say class simple middleware. So I want to define my constructor, so def init, and then my constructor, so self get response, which is very similar to before. And then self.getResponse is equals to getResponse. And then my call function, rename to def self request. Again, very similar to before. So print before the request process and then response. So self.getResponse request. And then when I've got a response, I can simply go after the response. All that's left is to return my response, save it, and then I go back to settings.py. I've written the wrong name. So simple middleware, I copy this and then I paste it here. Click on save, and now our server seems to be running properly. Let's now test this again. So if I click on send a couple of times, I should see the same logs occurring as before. Okay, so as you can see, I have the same logs as before. So if you want, before we get a response, we can even get the request body. So how do we do that? I can simply go request body. It's a variable, and then I use json.loads to get the JSON serialized structure of the request body. So request.body. I have to import JSON now. So import JSON. So now that I have my request body, if request body, I get the name of request body if it's equals to BSD, and if the request dot method. So if the request method was put, I can simply return a JSON response. I can simply return a message to the user saying secret name entered. Now I need to go back and fix my imports. So from Django.http import JSON response. I have to rename this to JSON response. So here what I'm doing is basically I'm checking that within the request body, if the name field was BSD, and if the method was put, then I output this message instead. Okay, so testing it out, for example, if I do a put request of an ID of 4, for example, and my body, in this case, it's BSD, I click on send. So now I get my secret name entered message. One thing you should remember is that according to Django's documentation, using the request.post function and trying to access the request body should normally be avoided. So this is something you guys should keep in mind while writing middleware code. Anyways, let's move on. Another use case of middleware is that maybe you want to check if a certain URL parameter, so for example, an ID or a name or something, and you want to check if that URL parameter is valid, you can even do with a certain hook. So it's called the process view hook. So def process view, and then self. The second parameter is request. So the request of the user, the view function. So what function was invoked for this view, the arguments for this view, and the keyword arguments for this view. So view kwargs. So to get the parameter, it's basically I can assign a variable called param id view kwarguments dot get id. So I want the ID here. Now that I have a param id, I can check if my param id was equals to 100. If it was 100, I return a JSON response error, and let's say this is a forbidden ID. Going back to my code here, if I do 100 this time, send, I get my message. There's another hook I would like to show you guys called process exception. So I'll say def process exception. So if you don't know what process exception is, this function is basically called whenever an exception occurs in your code base. So it has the following parameters. So self, request, and then the exception. So the request of the user and the exception that occurs. So if there is an exception, I can do return JSON response, error, error, and exception occurred. So I'll use one of my custom actions as an example. So in view sets, I had an action that was trying to retrieve an item from the database. If it doesn't get an item, it will throw an exception. If you don't know what actions are, I'll link the video in the description. Anyways, within my API client, I can use my action, so say hi ID, and if there's an ID that does not exist within my database, I expect an error to come up. It's a post, then send. It should be a /. Okay, so I get a message from the process view function. So let's use a different ID, 1000, and then send. So as you can see, the process exception function was invoked. That's it for today. In this video, you learned how to implement middleware within Django. To be specific, you learned how to process exceptions, obtain parameters from the process view function, and overall, you learned the basics of writing middleware in Django. If you guys have any questions, let me know in the comment section. That's it for today. Till then, bye bye.